Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, in this session today we are going to discuss a very important topic, and the topic is governance, a conceptual riddle or an ideological device. So dear friends, for this we have again with us in our studios Professor Riddle Chakrabarti, and as you all know that he is Professor in Department of Political Science, University of Delhi, and I hope that under his able guidance today you are going to get deep insight into this very topic. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest Professor Riddle Chakrabarti. Hello sir, welcome to the EDICIT lecture. As through our previous sessions also we have been learning through you a lot. I hope all the students or the viewers who might be watching us would be benefited from this particular lecture.
Thank you, Gitika, and it's a matter of great pleasure, to be back in your midst, and I am quite happy, to share my ideas on governance, on which I have been working for quite some time, and I am a little disturbed because to me governance as a concept is an attempt to replace public administration altogether. Now, I'm slightly old-fashioned in my thinking. That's why I still believe that public administration as a conceptual category has its validity. But there is a kind of massive endeavor on the part of several academicians all over the world to replace public administration by governance. So I think I'm trying to provide a kind of critique of governance from my own perception, and that's my concern today. But before I talk about the topic, let me just spend a couple of minutes on the title. Why did I mention it's a conceptual riddle or an ideological device? Because conceptual riddle, to me it's not very clear. To me it looks like a riddle which I have to decipher layer wise. And let's see whether I can succeed in deciphering the true nature of the conceptualization called governance. And I'll also try to show whether public administration continues to remain valid, continues to remain relevant insofar as our understanding goes. So to me it's not very conceptually a relevant idea that governance conveys for public administration, and I find there is a kind of serious contradiction between governance and public administration, because governance is not public administration. I mean, governance is far short of what is known as public administration. So to me it's not a conceptually very clear concept. Conceptually it is very vague kind of concept, and conceptually it is very confusing to me. So this is the first part, and the second part happens to be, is it an ideological device? I think I agree with this kind of conceptualization. Yes, it is an ideological device, because this is something which is been constructed in order to get rid of public administration and the nomenclature of public administration as public administration. And especially since the 1990s, there have been attempts to talk about governance in place of public administration deliberately, and this is essentially a kind of Western attempt to impose governance on non-Western world. And governance is that kind of goal, is that kind of objective which is being utilized to fulfill an ideological device, which becomes very important, which becomes evident following the articulation of neoliberal tradition in public administration. And if you want to know the historical roots, I think the collapse of the Soviet Union is a very important event in global history, and it also radically altered our perception about a lot of things, including public administration. So governance is rooted in that kind of social, economic and political environment which came out of the disintegration of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So from 1989 onwards, we are trying to play with the conceptualization of public administration. Some of us used it, what is known as new public management, about which I talked about, last time, and then some of us also talk about governance, but there are some probably a microscopic minority in the academia who still are very happy with the nomenclature called public administration because of these two characteristics of governance, which is a conceptual riddle on the one hand, and on the other hand it is an ideological device. So friends, I approach the problem with a very powerful critique by saying that governance is not an innocent construct. It is essentially an ideologically charged construct to fulfill a specific ideological goal, especially following the disintegration of the former Soviet Union or following the rise of a neoliberal political economy at the edges of the United States. So it's essentially a kind of neoliberal avalanche on our intellectual understanding of public administration. So governance is an outcome of that kind of processes, which we must keep it in mind. Now then comes, how do I approach the problem? First I approach the problem with a critique which I mentioned, which is conceptual riddle or an ideological device. Now I am thinking that how to contextualize governance. Why did governance become so powerful conceptualization at a particular point of time? Here I would like to draw attention to three important considerations. Now first of all, socially there has been a massive attack on public sector. Public sector loses its importance over a period of time, and public sector becomes redundant. Public sector becomes invalid as a conceptualization. So if you look at the world history since the 1980s, you will find that there has been a kind of massive attack on public sector units, because public sectors has not been able to contribute to the well-being of the people at large. So it doesn't serve the purpose for which it was created. So it was not a kind of people-friendly endeavor. Public sector became a kind of an instrument for personal aggrandizement, personal gratifying kind of endeavor. So public sector becomes the target of serious attack by the people all over the world. This is the first consideration which we must keep it in mind. The second consideration is that globally we find the kind of interdependent governmental activities. Government no longer remains isolated, and given the fact that the globe has become one with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we find that it is one particular kind of ideological motive which became important following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you find a new kind of globe which is interdependent, which becomes an instrument of interdependence, and that means it draws on each other. So the countries which were independent nationally before the collapse of the Soviet Union became interdependent. So globally there has been a kind of interdependent governmental arrangement which has become a very critical dimensions of the new era known as neoliberal era of political economy. The second, academically, we find that there has been a very clear shift from positive paradigm to post-positive paradigm. Now what do I mean by that? Now positive paradigm, if you look at the conceptual roots, you will find it talks about objectivity. Positive paradigm articulates things, articulates phenomena in terms of objectivity of the phenomena. Now post-positivism talks about interconnectivity, complexity and interaction and processes. Now post-positivism, they want to conceptualize world as part of interaction, as part of complex social, economic and political processes. So there is nothing called objectivity. It is relative to the situation, is relative to the social, economic and political circumstances. So friends, there are three important considerations which according to me contributed to the articulation of governance in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I'll come to the period very soon. So the first is socially, there has been a significant attack on public sector. The second, the government has become interdependent on each other. It's no longer as isolated as it was before. And thirdly, academically, we find a very clear shift between positive perception of phenomena to post-positive perception of the globe, which means that the globe is now an interactive activity globe is to be understood as part of the processes. Globe has to be understood as a very complex social, economic and political dynamics. So these, to me, these are three important considerations which you should keep it in mind to understand governance. Now then there comes, what is governance? Now governance to me is a very unusual animal, because so far if you look at public administration evolution, you will find that each and every phase we have academicians' contribution to the conceptualization of public administration in different form. Whether you talk of Minerbrook I, which contributed to new public administration in 1968, whether you talk of Minerbrook II, which contributed to the conceptualization of new public management in 1988, and whether you talk of 2008 Minerbrook III conferences, which also conceptualized public administration more or less in the line of new public administration. So far, if you look at the history or the evolution of public administration, you will find that it is essentially academicians' contribution to the nomenclature of public administration. For the first time in the history of public administration, we find governance is the contribution of the practitioners of governance. Those who practice governance, those who contribute to governance, they are the ones who contributed to the conceptualization of public administration. So those who are involved in governance are the person who contributed to its conceptualization. So this is the first thing, it is practitioners' contribution to public administration. The second is that now we are thinking in terms of efficiency. Now public administration can both be effective and efficient. Now effective means to get things done, and efficiency means the optimal utilization of resources for a particular kind of activity. Now nowadays, with the kind of importance of managerial activity, the importance of managerial inputs, managerial ingredients, public administration is heading towards efficiency, not effectiveness. So if it is efficient, then probably governance will contribute to public administration. If it is not efficient, then governance will not talk about it at all. That's the kind of conceptualization. So public administration, in order to become viable, has to be efficient. It has to be efficient. If it is effective, it is no longer useful insofar as governance is concerned. The second is that, to me, governance is highly a political conceptualization, in the sense that governance talks about Western liberal democracy. Now, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world became unipolar, in the sense that it is essentially a kind of hegemonic importance of liberal democracy of the Westminster variety, of the Western variety. So to me, governance emerged in that particular social, economic and political context in which liberal democracy is considered to be the only form of political articulation. So that means what? To me, governance is highly political, in the sense that by talking about liberal democracy, it is actually linked with one kind of political articulation, namely liberal democracy. And the second and the final point, that the governance is also rooted in the failure of the state-led development paradigm. Now, everybody is questioning that the state-governed developmental paradigm is of no use, and I think the Soviet Russia has shown the way that, given the fact that the Soviet Russia became so poor, Soviet Russia could not solve the basic problems of human existence, and that shows that state-led development plan is essentially of no use. Same is true in India. I mean, we also appreciated state-led development in India after independence, but you know that after 6 decades of independence, we still have almost 24% of our population who are living below poverty line. They are known as what is called below poverty line families. So that means what? That means there is a kind of serious question on the appropriateness of the state-led development paradigm. So I think, friends, when you talk of governance, we are thinking in terms of 4 important features. First, as I mentioned, it is essentially a practitioner's contribution. Second, it talks about efficiency. Third, it is highly political because it talks about only liberal democracy of the Western variety. And thirdly, it also questions state-led development paradigm. So these are the kind of four important ways we can conceptualize governance or we define governance. So unlike public administration, governance has got different kind of nomenclature which is evident from this kind of discussion. Now how do we define governance? This is very interesting, tricky, and then from this definition probably you can link it with my first assumption that it is essentially an ideological device. Now when you define public administration, it has got three important features. Public administration talks about a structure, public administration talks about processes, and public administration talks about a purpose, because it is about public. An administration which is meant for public is the purpose. So public administration talks about a structure. It talks, if you recollect Weberian discussion, public administration is considered to be pyramidic in its manifestation. And secondly, public administration functions through well-defined processes, rules, regulations, and everything. And then public administration, because it talks about public, it has got a specific goal, specific purpose. So this is public administration. Now in contrast with public administration definition, if you look at governance, you will see that the governance talks about only the structure and process. Governance does not talk about the purpose. So the goal of public administration is entirely missing in the governance discourse. Governance is only about the structure, the pyramid structure of the Weberian variety, and governance also talks about specific processes, but governance is silent insofar as the goal is concerned. So to me this is a very important difference which you should keep it in mind, and to show that the governance can't be public administration. Governance is not at all public administration, simply because governance lacks miserably the goal for which public administration stands. The third important point, it talks about a system. It talks about a system in which power center is diffused. Because if you think in terms of bureaucracy, especially Weberian bureaucracy tends to be centralized. But if you look at governance, you will find that governance tends to be decentralized. So there is not a kind of single power center. On the contrary, power center is diffused, and the decision making body has become plural. So there are multiple agencies which are involved in the decision making processes. So this is the second point which we must keep it in mind, and as a result of that we are thinking in terms of decision making, which is essentially a multilateral brokerage both inside and outside the organization. That means what? Now if you look at Weberian bureaucracy, you will find Weberian bureaucracy decides on the basis of things from within. I mean, there is nothing called outside agency which influence or which impinge upon the decisions taken by bureaucracy. But in case of governance, decision is taken also by the factors which are operating outside bureaucracy, because decision is essentially an outcome of some kind of brokerages between both inside and outside the organization. And the final point is, as a result of this kind of features, organization has to be collegial, organization has to be consensual, organization has to be consultative. So decision making process is now reformed, is now revised. There is a kind of an attempt to reinvent the decision making as a conceptual category. Now decision making is not the prerogative of bureaucracy per se. On the contrary, decision making is also a process in which not only bureaucracy but also there are agencies outside the bureaucracy which are equally important in so far as decision making is concerned. Because the main purpose or the main goal of governance model or governance discourse is to evolve an organization which is consultative, which is consensual, and which is collegial. So these are three important features which to be distinguish governance from public administration. Public administration was slightly a closed model if you believe in Weberian bureaucracy, but if you think in terms of governance, then it is certainly different from Weberian bureaucracy, because this attempt, this conceptualization talks about decision making which is open-ended simply, and that's why organization is always defined as consensual, consultative and collegial. Now, then comes sources. What are the sources from which this particular idea of governance came out? So, this is important. Now, when you talk of governance, we usually start with World Bank report. Two important reports which are very critical, and then the third report came little later. When you talk of governance, if you look at the prevalent literature, the available texts on governance, you will invariably find that everybody is talking about this World Bank reports. But I have a different point of view, because I have found out that the idea of governance, the conceptualization of governance, can be traced back to a particular book which was published in 1972. The author of the book happens to be Harlan Cleveland. Harlan Cleveland, 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 Harlan Cleveland. And the title of the book was The Future Executive Guide, a Guide for Tomorrow's Managers. The Future Executive, a Guide for Tomorrow's Managers. Now, this particular book, if you look at this particular book actually, understood governance in its most intricate meaning. Now, one of the basic conceptualization of Cleveland happens to be that what the people want is less government and more governance. Now, what he meant by that? He actually meant that he is not interested in talking about the institutions of government. When you talk of government, we are talking in terms of several institutions which run the government. You can think of parliament, we can think of cabinet, we can think of judiciary, we can think of other agencies, several committees you can think of. So when you talk of government, we are thinking in terms the fundamental institutions which are responsible for running the government. So Harlan Cleveland argues that we are not interested in institutions, we are interested in governance. Means what? We are interested in the delivery of services. So he actually hit the bull's eye by saying that we are interested not on the institution of government, but we are interested in the delivery of services for the people. So he was actually adopting a people-friendly model of public administration. Now, which is actually governance. Governance talks about people-friendly public administration, in a different way. So, the friends, I just talked about text, an intellectual text written by Harlan Cleveland in 1972, which talks about governance. So, to me, intellectually, when you argue that governance is a practitioner's contribution, is partly correct in the sense that it was highlighted in a very magnificent way, in a very detailed manner in the World Bank reports, but it was introduced as a concept by Cleveland as early as 1972. Then we will talk about three World Bank reports. The first World Bank report, which is very significant, is called From Crisis to Sustainable Growth of 1989. Now, this particular report was published with reference to Sub-Saharan Africa. And Sub-Saharan Africa is a very unstable kind of entity, because most of the countries which are part of Sub-Saharan Africa were very unstable, and they were mostly ruled by military junta. As a result, what happened when they took money from the global agencies, especially the World Bank and IMF, they could not repay the loan, because the change of government was so frequent that the new government was not willing to take the legacy, take the liability of the earlier government. So as a result, World Bank was losing a lot of money. So it's essentially an attempt to recover the loan which World Bank gave to these countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's essentially a report of the donors, mainly the World Bank, to get back the money which they gave as a kind of loan. So this is the first report which was applicable to the Sub-Saharan African countries. The second report was published in 1992. Now, unlike the first report, which was meant for a particular segment of the globe, the second report was meant for the globe as a whole. So the domain of the second report happens to be the entire globe, unlike the first report, which was actually confined to sub-Saharan Africa. And the third report, which was published in 2003, is entitled Enhancing Governance in MENA, M-E-N-A. Now, MENA means Middle Eastern and North African countries. MENA is a World Bank conceptualization, which means Middle Eastern and North African countries. So, friends, I'll just show you that Cleveland and these three reports talk about governance as a conceptual category. Now, besides this, I also would like to add CAPAM, C-A-P-A-M. Again, it's an acronym, which means Commonwealth Association of Public Administration and Management. Commonwealth Association of Public Administration and Management. Now, this particular association held a conference in 1994, and there they adopted governance by talking about managerial intervention, and they subjected public administration to competition. So, public administration now is subject to competition. It can't be protected as it was the case in the past. So, CAPAM conference of 1994 recognized the importance of managerial intervention in public administration, and is also allowed public administration to be subjected to competition. So, what does it mean? It means it has become official. CAPAM officially recognized governance as a conceptualization. So, friends, when we talk about the sources, we are thinking in terms of three complementary sources. The first is absolutely intellectual source, because it's an academic work made by Harlan Cleveland, and he talked about governance in conceptual fashion by saying that what he argues for more governance and less government. And I talked about that government means institutions. He was actually questioning the institutions, and he was actually in favor of efficient delivery of services. So, governance means what is called delivery of services. And then I talked about three World Bank report, which I'll elaborate in a few minutes. It started with 1989 report, which was confined to sub-Saharan Africa, and then it was followed by another report which was meant for the globe as a whole in 1992, and then third is very specific kind of report which is applicable to Middle Eastern countries and North African countries, which also talks about enhancing governance. So, these are the three important World Bank reports which we should take into account. And then finally, I said it was officially recognized by the academicians who congregated in a conference in 1994, which known the conference of CAPAM, Commonwealth Association of Public Administration and Management. That conference officially recognized governance as a conceptualization. Now, what is the theoretical basis of governance? Governance as a concept has come out of certain theoretical foundation. Now, here I am going to talk about the theoretical foundation of governance as a conceptual category. Now, when you talk of theoretical foundations, the first theoretical foundation happens to be public choice theory. Now, what is public choice theory? Now, public choice theory is essentially a theory which was developed by James Buchanan and Gordon R. Tullock in his famous book, The Calculus of Consent. Now, in this particular book, The Calculus of Consent, Tullock and Buchanan, they talked about non-economic aspect. By using economic tools, they actually used what is called the fundamental tools of trade theory to understand the behavior of bureaucracy. So, they were trying to understand public administration with reference to economic yardstick, namely specific theoretical models of the trade theory. Now, what are the ideas they put forward? Now, there are three important ideas which I should focus on. The first, they talked about methodological individualism. The second, they talked about Pareto's optimality, and third, they talked about democratic administration. Now, what is methodological individualism? Now, Buchanan and Tullock, they argue that when individual decides, they decide in terms of certain methodology. So decisions are to be methodological. Decisions can't be whimsical. That is the point they are making. Now, what do they mean by this? They argue that, whenever we take a decision, we usually follow three important processes, which they define as the process of intelligence, the process of design, the process of choice. Now, intelligence, design and choice, these are the three important processes which contribute to a particular decision. Now, what do they mean? First, intelligence. He said, whenever human beings get involved in taking a particular decision, he has to be intelligent enough to understand options. So, you have got different alternatives. You will be able to understand the alternatives only when you are intelligent enough to assess the importance of the alternatives. So, this is intelligence activity. Then once you have alternatives, several alternatives, then you pick up one and then you decide how to articulate that alternative in terms of a particular decision. Then you pick up one, this is called designing. You are taking up one on the basis of several alternatives, and then of these alternatives you make a choice. And once your choice is made, once you choose a particular decision, your decision is taken. So, they argue that in individual, when individual takes a decision, individual follows these three important processes: intelligence activity, design activity and choice activity. So, this is the first dimension of public choice theory, that individual chooses by being methodological. That's the basic assumption which is implied in methodological individualism. The second point is Pareto's optimality. Now, this is essentially a kind of very conjectural conceptualization. Now, Pareto's optimality talks about a situation where everybody is well off, nobody is less off. Now, if everybody is well off, there will be no crisis. Then the decisions can be taken optimally. So, Pareto's optimality means that we are thinking in terms of distribution of wealth in such a way that everybody is well off. Everybody is not suffering from any crisis. Everybody is deserves, everybody gets what everybody wants. So, this is essentially kind of optimal conceptualization of demand and supply, which Pareto talks about. He said that we have to think in terms of a society where distribution is made in such a way that there will be no crisis, there will be no dearth of goods, there will be no dearth of usable goods. So, everybody is well off and nobody is less off. This is the kind of conjectural situation which Pareto talks about by evolving his model of optimality. The third point, which is interesting, democratic administration. Now, by democratic administration, he is talking about one, decentralization of authority, second, administration politics linkages and multi-level organizational activities while taking a decision. Now, these three important dimensions are very significant. The first, as I mentioned, that governance is an attack on Weberian democracy. Now, Weberian democracy tends to be centralized, tends to centralize authority. Everything evolves around the boss. The boss is the supreme authority insofar as decision making is concerned. But governance questions that assumption and talks about decentralization of authority. So, authority, in order to be efficient, authority in order to be workable, public administration in order to be workable has to be decentralized. Now, this is also a point which an American public administration specialist called V. Ostrom, he talks about in detail in his book, The Crisis of American Public Administration, which was published in the 70s. So, Ostrom's conceptualization of democratic decentralization suggests that authority, in order to be efficient, in order to be workable, has to be decentralized. So, by making this assumption, Ostrom along with Buchanan and Tulloch, they are questioning Weberian notion of centralized hierarchical bureaucratic organization. This is the first point. The second point, they argue that administration cannot be conceptualized without politics. They argue that administration is the articulation of political views. We need politicians, because politicians bring values to administration, and administration is responsible for articulating those values in terms of action or deeds. Now, this is quite evident, this is quite obvious if you look at administration in actual functioning. Now, think of India. India before 1991 and after 1991, are two different India. Before 1991, we are thinking in terms of socialistic pattern of society. Now, that was the value which was endorsed by, reinforced by the Nehruvian type of leadership, which India had succeeded after independence. Now, after 1991, we adopted new economic policy, which talks about liberalization, which talks about linkages with other global powers. So, they adopted what is called open economy policy in contrast with socialistic pattern of society. Now, in these two different circumstances, politicians were very important because they brought these ideas. In one case it was socialistic pattern of society, on another you will find they are talking about liberalization, they are talking about globalization, they are talking about privatization. So, I think politics is an important dimension insofar as administration is concerned. Administration becomes speechless, if I use the metaphor. Administration becomes speechless without politics, because politics provides what I call the nervous system of administration. Without politics, administration becomes ineffective. This is the second point which we talk about with regard to democratic administration. The third point is that when you think in terms of governance, we are thinking in terms of multi-level organizational system of administration. What do I mean by it? I mean that in this case, besides bureaucracy, besides governmental organization known as bureaucracy, there are non-bureaucratic organizations, there are non-bureaucratic agencies which are important insofar as decision making is concerned. Now, I will give you a very concrete example. Now, India Against Corruption, the movement which Anna Hazare launched, it was essentially a movement for an efficient Lokpal bill. Now, Lokpal bill is actually the prerogative of Parliament in consultation with the bureaucracy. But India Against Corruption, that particular movement, the civil society movement, gave enough inputs to the Lokpal bill. So, now here what does it mean? It means that besides Parliament, besides bureaucracy, we have got India Against Corruption as a campaign which also provided inputs to the formulation of the Lokpal bill. Now, this suggests that now we are thinking in terms of multi-level centers of decision making, which is partly given by civil society, which is also partly given by non-bureaucratic organization besides civil society. So, there are a lot of non-government organizations besides bureaucracy, besides civil society. So, they are also important insofar as decision making is concerned. So, friends, when you talk of theoretical basis, I have in mind, as I mentioned, two important dimensions of the theoretical basis of the governance. First, which call public choice theory, and the second I talk about democratic administration. And public choice theory is essentially the contribution of James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, and democratic administration is essentially a contribution of Vincent Ostrom, who wrote about the democratic administration extensively, and he elaborated that in the context of governance, we are heading towards democratic administration, which was not the case when we endorsed Weberian form of governance. Now, then comes the actual reports. When you talk of actual reports, as I mentioned few minutes ago, we have got 3 World Bank reports. The first World Bank report was introduced in 1989, the second was published in 1992, and third one was published in 2003. Now, the first World Bank report, 1989 report, if you talk about 1989 report, it has got 4 important features. The first, they are questioning, as I mentioned, public sector. So, they are now insisting that we have to think in terms of public sector management as efficiently as possible. They're talking about accountability, that the public administration has to be accountable for its act to the people at large. That means what? Public administration has to be citizen friendly, and public administration is responsible for its act to the citizens, the customer, the clients of public administration. Then the third point is that there has to be well-defined legal framework for development. Now, legal framework means, they're talking essentially about rule of law, constitution. So you have to have a constitution which talks about well-defined rules and regulations to govern public administration. This is the third point. And the fourth point, they're talking about information and transparency. That means, every information relating to public administration has to be given. Administration decides, but on the basis of what? That has to be made very clear to the people at large. And as a result, the government has to be transparent. Everything should be visible. There is nothing called, behind the door activities. So the first report, when they talk about the features, they are actually focusing on essentially the changing nature of public administration. Public administration has to think in terms of management of the inefficient public sectors. So they are trying to attribute inefficiency of public sector to mismanagement. So if you think in terms of proper management of public sector, probably public sector is likely to be efficient. That's the kind of assumption that run through this point. The second is accountability. Now you are accountable. You are performing certain functions on the basis of your salary, which you get out of state exchequer, out of taxpayers' money. So if the taxpayers contribute to your salary, then taxpayers have every right to find out your activities. So you have to be accountable to those who are contributing to your salary by paying tax. This is the second point. And the third point, they are insistent. World Bank was insisting that most of the chaos, most of the mismanagement is largely due to the absence of a legal framework, well-defined legal framework, namely constitution. They are talking about the constitution. They are talking about well-defended rule of law and regulations. And finally, they are insisting on information and transparency. Now, friends, this is an interesting point. When I talk about that this particular model of 1989 is confined to only sub-Saharan Africa, and the purpose was genuine because World Bank gave money. World Bank wanted to get back that money which was given as a loan. So understandable that it was meant for sub-Saharan Africa. But by 1989, there is a massive change in the globe. The fall of Berlin Wall, the end of Cold War, the rise of American hegemony because of the collapse of the former Soviet Union. So by 1992, American hegemony was established. The world became what is known as unipolar. So it was essentially American hegemony which was articulated in the next report. The first report was confined to a specific segment of the globe, sub-Saharan Africa. The second report of 1992, it was meant for everybody. It was meant for all the countries. So now the World Bank, what is called, has firmly established its grip over the globe, because now World Bank knows that there is no Soviet Union. There is only the American hegemony. There is only the liberal democratic setup. So World Bank wanted to pursue that kind of ideological goal by way of adopting a particular report which was conducive to liberal democracy. Now in this particular report, they insisted on 3 points. The first, they are talking about the forms of political regime. The second, they are talking about the processes in which power is exercised. And the third, they are talking about the capacity of the government to formulate, design and execute policy. Now friends, as I mentioned, that it was essentially an hegemony of liberal democracy. The World Bank now is interested in the form of political regime. Is it democratic or is it non-democratic? Is it democratic of the liberal variety or is it democratic of the former Soviet variety? So if it is the former, then World Bank will not give you money. So in order to get funding from the World Bank, you have to have a system of governance which is to be liberal democratic in nature. So in a way it was an imposition that only liberal democratic countries of the globe are entitled to get World Bank funding, and the rest, they don't have any option, they don't have any chance to get money, to get funding from the World Bank. So now what is it? The ideological grip is now tightened by the World Bank. This is the first point. The second, the process in which power is exercised. So they are questioning what is called the centralized bureaucracy, centralized authority. They are actually trying to insist on liberal democratic methods in the exercise of power. So by talking about the processes in which power is exercised, they are actually talking about liberal democratic method. And finally, the capacity of the government. Is the government capable to execute, to design, to articulate this kind of position? If the government is capable, all right, we'll give you money. If the government is not capable, sorry, we can't give you money. That's a kind of implicit assumption. So World Bank tightened its grip over the globe by adopting this kind of position in the 1989 World Bank report. Now, enhancing governance in MENA 2003, to me, is this particular report is understudied. This particular report is not talked about at length by the academicians when they discuss, but I think this particular report has a critical role to play insofar as governance is concerned, because governance is an idea which was reinforced by 1989 report, by 1992 report, and we stopped there. But I think this particular report, which was meant for Middle Eastern countries and North African countries, is also equally important insofar as conceptualization of governance is concerned. Now, the title is very interesting. They are talking about enhancing governance, MENA. Now, when they talk about enhancing governance, they try to understand the interface between inclusiveness and accountability. Inclusiveness and accountability. Now, by being inclusive means you have to take into account each and every segment of society, each and every areas of society, whether it's rural or urban, whether it is poor or the rich, whether it is more developed or less developed. So by being inclusive, the World Bank is insisting of a form of government in which everybody, regardless of class, regardless of clan, regardless of ethnicity, becomes part of governance. So accountability and inclusiveness, these are the two important ideas which this particular report talks about again and again. And he said that you have to have a constitution, you have to have liberal democratic system, but at the same time the aim of the liberal democratic system and the constitution is to have inclusiveness and accountability. And they are talking about 5 different ways. The first, they are talking in terms of what is called national action to enhance external accountability. That means government is accountable to civil society activities as well, the external accountability. Local actions to strengthen external accountability. That means local government is also responsible to ascertain accountability. That you are getting money out of the taxpayers' pocket, so you have to show accountability to the citizens. The third, national checks and balances to strengthen internal accountability. Here they are actually talking about the constitution. So the constitution is nothing but combination of checks and balances. If the constitution is in its place, then administration has to be efficient. That's an understanding which they talk about. And then you have to think in terms of regular reforms of administration, regular reforms of civil service. So these are the 5 important ways, 5 important means by which governance can be implemented. So they are talking about external accountability. That means government is to be accountable to the external agencies. It is not merely internal accountability. And this is combined with the accountability which is established by the constitution. And then finally they are talking about regular reforms of civil service, because civil service is the instrument through which governance is articulated. So unless and until you have civil service reform, you cannot think of changing nature of public administration. So friends, unlike those two reports, this is very precise in terms of understanding the interface between accountability and inclusiveness. Now, if I summarize the point which I made with regard to 3 World Bank reports, what are the points which I have in mind? I have in mind 4 different points. The first, these 3 World Bank reports talk about 1, accountability. Accountability to the citizens, accountability to the clients, accountability to the consumers of services. This is the first point they insist. The second point is transparency. Government has to be transparent, because whatever is doing, whatever is being happening within the government, inside the government, has to be visible, has to be transparent, because there is nothing, what is called behind the door activity. Because governance is meant for public, people at large. So people have every right to know what is happening inside the government. So transparency is another thing. Predictability. Now, if you follow a particular constitution, you are actually showing symptoms of predictability, that everything is predictable, because constitution has got well defined rules and the people follow those particular rules. So if you act in accordance with those particular rules, your action is likely to have a particular feature. So that means what? Accountability, transparency and predictability. These are 3 important features. Now these 3 features are possible only when people participate. So participatory governance is the aim of the governance discourse, that in the governance activity, people participate to make it efficient, to make it transparent, to make it accountable, to make it predictable. So the final point is that they are talking about people friendly governance, and people friendly governance, if it is established firmly, then only accountability, transparency and predictability are likely to happen. So if I take everything together, what does it mean? It means a very interesting thing to me. Governance is nothing but an interface between state, market and civil society. These are the 3 important ingredients of governance. Governance talks about the state, they can't get rid of state, but the state is not alone, state is not isolated. State has to take into account the market forces, and the state will decide its course of action only in response to the inputs from the market. Now this is the second player in governance. The third player happens to be civil society. That means external agencies. I just made the point a few minutes ago that they are insistent on what is called external accountability. That means what? You are accountable to the agencies outside the government. The government is there. Government is there and government is accountable in terms of the constitution. That's there. But at the same time, government is accountable to the people at large, to the civil society organization, to the non-governmental organization, to the non-bureaucratic organization outside government. So I think, friends, to me, governance is nothing but an interface between state, market and civil society. Now, what are the driving forces? The driving forces are very, revealing. The first, the demand supply, second, the rule of law, and third, civic engagement. If you look at the function of the government, you will find these are the 3 important features which are significant: demand supply, then rule of law, and then finally civic engagement. So the governance is that kind of activity which talks about demand and supply, which talks about rule of law, and which also talks about civic engagement. That means involvement of civil society, involvement of agencies outside government is also critical in so far as governance is concerned. Now then finally, friends, how do I conclude? I am concluding by reference to 4 important points. The first, if you look at governance, and if we remember the discussion which we had, governance is nothing but neo-Taylorism. What do I mean by that? Now, you must have read Taylor, Frederick Taylor. He was the one who talked about a specific model of mechanization of administration, and he tried to evolve what is called a universal model of public administration by being mechanically approaching public administration. That means, if I use a very common nomenclature, there he was actually insisting on one size fits all formula. That means, public administration model has to be universal. That's the point he was making. Now, if you accept governance, the way governance was articulated with reference to the World Bank report and with reference to Harlan Cleveland's conceptualization, governance is talking about one particular way of looking at administration. Now, that's absurd. Public administration is contextual. Public administration cannot be neo-Taylorism. That's one. Secondly, the structured organization as critical. Now, public administration can't be structured all the time. If you think in terms of the role of civil society is a very haphazard kind of activity. So, if you take into account the role of a haphazard kind of activity of civil society, then how can you think of structured organization? So, structured organization is to me a misnomer insofar as governance is concerned, because public administration in the sense of governance cannot be organized in a structured manner because of the prevalence of civil society activities. This is the second point. The third point, in the entire discussion, you will hardly find the role of politics. The politics, as I mentioned, is an ambience, is a milieu, and this milieu is important. This milieu cannot be ignored. Now, public administration is part of that milieu. So, if you ignore the milieu, how can you conceptualize public administration? So, governance, by ignoring politics, the milieu, is actually trying to understand public administration in a unique fashion by ignoring the role of politics in public administration. Now, politics and administration are integrally connected, are intimate bedfellows. You can't think of one without the other. So, governance and public politics are integrally connected. By ignoring politics, they are actually using governance in a very restrictive manner. And the final point, restrictive meaning of democracy and the process of negotiation and contestation. Now, when they talk about democracy, they are actually thinking in terms of merely negotiation and contestation. They are forgetting that democracy is also a process in which negotiation and contestation are important. Now, you cannot ignore democracy as a process which is meaningful not only in governance but also in terms of the interface between state, market and civil society. So, if you ignore the idea of process, then you cannot capture the true meaning of democracy. So, friends, governance is certainly a very refreshing approach to public administration, but it is not a complete approach to public administration, because that's why I argued at the very outset that it is both a conceptual riddle to me and also an ideological device to challenge the non-liberal way of looking at public administration. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving such a productive session. We have no time left with us, so thank you very much.